Hi everyone, English 4113, History and Lit. Today you're turning in papers, so I am also probably a little bit behind on the coursework. I'm recording this about 20 minutes before class starts. So I'm going to move through this a little bit quickly. I'm going to introduce you briefly to Frantz Fanon, also talk a little bit about the Plinian monsters, and then talk about the King of Tars and Middle English. So Frantz Fanon was born in Martinique in 1925. He dies in Bethesda, Maryland in 1961 of cancer. And his most famous works, two of which I read as an undergraduate in my French class, are The Wretched of the Earth, 1961, Dying Colonialism, 1959, Black Skins, White Masks, 1952. So you've read a little bit of Black Skins, White Masks, and I just want to, of course, call attention to a particular word that's used in it, which is probably the most forbidden word in the English language, and we're not going to be using it at all in this class. If you want to refer to it, you can call it that slur or perhaps even the N-word, but it's the word you can't say. So don't say it in this class, please. Thank you very much. So he is, among other things, a philosopher and a psychoanalyst who is deeply concerned with the psychological damage that's done to people of color by colonialism. So he's writing as a Black man, Martinique, and what is at the time a colonial possession of France. And then he is particularly concerned with the revolution in Algeria and an attempt by the Algerians to throw off French government. And he is, in this work, the chapter of Black Skins, White Masks that we read, if you've read much French philosophy at all, you're going to recognize there are certain features in it that are very, very familiar. It's clear that Fanon has been reading Sartre, not just because he's citing him, but also simply because he is engaging with issues of existentialism and with the work of Hegel, who's a German philosopher who's very important as an intellectual forebear of Karl Marx. I don't have time right now to go into talking about what Sartre and Hegel and also Karl Jaspers lend to Fanon, but they are important for understanding his intellectual background and how he's engaging as a Black man with an absence in their philosophy when they're thinking about the problems of being human and of human consciousness. The big question for Fanon is, where does a Black man fit into this? What is my particular experience, and how does that challenge the various universal claims that Hegel, Jaspers, and Sartre make? So, key phrase in reading this chapter is this one: all I wanted was to be a man among men. But then look at page 86 and see how he handles that. So we'll do that in class. A very quick summary of what this chapter is doing, because if you're unfamiliar with this kind of language, it may have been difficult to track fully what it was he was doing. Effectively, as a Black man in a world ruled by whites and dominated by whites, Fanon finds that he's an object. He tries to respond rationally to this. And even when he's able to demonstrate that he has particular skills, that he's an intellectual, that he's well-read, even if he's personally respected, he finds that it's always provisional, right? He's one of the good ones. And all it takes to be one of the bad ones is to screw up once. There's absolutely no room for forgiveness in a white world when a Black man screws up. They are basically casting shame on the entire race. He talks also a bit about the relationship between anti-Blackness and anti-Semitism, which is something I'll talk about in the next slide. And he is just trying to figure out how can he respond to this. It's, basically he can have Black skin and a white mask always go around pretending to be like a white Frenchman, but that's not good enough. It's really not going to get him the respect that he deserves. And it's certainly not going to give him the mental peace that he wants. So it's not enough just to claim Blackness and real Black history as a counter. He tries to do that. And he reads along with a set of Black poets and intellectuals, many of them from West Africa and from the Caribbean, who are advancing a politics of negritude, which is advancing poetry and plays that are putting Blackness at the center of intellectual activity, right? Pushing against the false universalism of European philosophy. And one thing to bear in mind, I think, is this slogan, I wish America loved Black people just as much as they love Black culture. That, of course, is not Frantz Fanon. I encountered this in various places, but also this weekend on a Black Lives Matter march, where I saw it on many people's t-shirts. It's from this person, Jalen Rose. I'm not a basketball person, so I don't even know who he is, but I looked him up. Look at page 98 in the Fanon, and you can see how he's working with that, right? He is also dealing with this in a French context. But ultimately, the thing that Fanon is troubled by is this idea that fighting on behalf of Black people ultimately has to give way to fighting on behalf of all oppressed people, in particular oppressed workers. Where does his experience as Black man fit into that? Is he obligated to abandon his own personal experience in favor of a universal struggle? And he's not sure where he is. As he ends the essay, he's caught between nothingness and infinity, and he doesn't know where he fits. What that reminded me of is a book that I read very earlier this year, I think in June, by Frank Wilderson III, his book Afro-Pessimism, which I think is an extraordinary book and very challenging to various notions of resistance, because Wilderson is saying that there is a unique experience of being Black in this world, which is not transferable to anybody else's experience. And so, as much as he would like to fight alongside Indigenous people, alongside Jews, for example, he finds that the prejudice and the cruelty that's directed against Black people is of its own character, and it's so intense and so particular that it can't be translated to anybody else's experience. It's clear that Wilderson, of course, knows Fanon because he's a very well-read person, but he's developing, I think, some of Fanon's ideas. I recommend this book, at any rate. Okay, switching gears very quickly, because we're running out of time. We have a little bit of the Middle English Cursor Mundi that we read for today. And you encounter these really strange people. And it says one of the things about them is their heads are in their chests. They are a kind of creature or person or monster or race even, depending on what term you want to use. And there's lots of debates about what to call these things, who are called the Blemi. They are described influentially in a work of Greek natural history by a guy named Pliny. So these are sometimes called the Plinian monsters, and even sometimes the Plinian races, although I find that's a problematic term. And they are repeatedly talked about over the centuries. The basic idea is that when you travel, the further away from home you get, the weirder things get. And eventually you're always going to find some of these monsters. Are they people? Are they animals? What are they? And so here's an illustration from a manuscript of Marco Polo that shows a bunch of Blemi. We also, if you've read Othello, the play by Shakespeare, which is early 17th century, one of the ways that Othello woos Desdemona is he brags about having come into contact with cannibals and also with Blemi. He says, when he's recounting how it was that he managed to have her fall in love with him, he says, it was my hint to speak, such was my process. And of the cannibals that each other eat, the anthropophagy, and men whose heads do grow beneath their shoulders, these things to hear would Desdemona seriously incline. So he manages to impress a lady by talking about monsters. So there is an intellectual tradition that involves these particular creatures. But you'll notice the Cursor Mundi makes them Black. That may be highly significant. Then, finally, two more things. The King of Tars has this bit where it's drawing on a widespread story about a Christian princess who marries a Muslim ruler in what's now probably like modern day Georgia or Armenia or someplace near there. And they have a child, and that child is born wrong in some way because she's a Christian and he's a Muslim. And so it's a kind of religions can't mix notion, a kind of racialization of religion. In the earlier versions of this story, that child is born in Sometimes it's part animal. Oftentimes it's hairy. Sometimes it just has no shape at all. And sometimes it's part black and part white. Now, the Middle English King of Tars makes a very interesting change to that old story, is that the baby is born featureless. So the problem with the baby is not that it's part black and part white, or it's animal, or it's hairy. It's just that it's basically like a lump. And the blackness is then put onto the Muslim ruler, the Sultan. And he also gets his own transformation that's unique, that doesn't happen in any other version of the story. It's one of the reasons the Middle English one is so very interesting. So I just want you to be aware of that. Okay, finally, a little bit about Middle English, because we're going to talk about this in class. So this is the opening of the King of Tars in Middle English. I'll read it to you in case you have to watch this on the video. Herkneth to me, both eld and ying, for Mari's love, that sweet a thing, al hu aware began, between a true Christian king and an heathen hey lording of Damas the Sudan. The King of Tars had a wief, fair mich non bin olive, that any week telekan. A docht they had him between, non fair woman, micht ben, is wheat is feather of swan. So you will notice I pronounce all the letters. You'll notice that the vowels are not pronounced like modern English, but they're pronounced more like the vowels in Spanish or French or German. And you will also notice in terms of the syntax, oftentimes what we'd expect in modern syntax is reversed slightly. Listen to me, both old and young, right? Rather than both old and young, listen to me. For Mary's love, that sweet person, all about how a war began. You'll notice then that oftentimes syntactical rules that we expect in modern English are not followed. Word order is often different. And I can talk about why that is in class, but it more or less has to do with English being descended from a Germanic language. So that's all I have time to do right now, but I'm really looking forward to talking about these texts in class. Keep the Fanon in mind. It may not be relevant directly for today, but it's going to be very relevant for a lot of the reading we do throughout the semester. So always bear in mind this work by a Black man trying to figure out how he is supposed to conceive of himself and understand himself in a world that's white dominated, which was true in the 1950s and in many ways remains still true in 2020. Okay, thank you so much.